Let's go back to the book of Jude. And we were just putting the background to the book of Jude. I was telling you that the book of Jude was written by a man who himself is known as Jude. That's what is entirely believed in the scriptures, or at least by those who study the Bible. They believe this man called Jude was one of the brothers of Jesus, because we know, at least from Matthew chapter 13 verse 55, Mark chapter 6 verse 3, that Jesus also, other than himself, he also had siblings. By siblings we mean Jesus on earth was known as the son of Joseph, and he also was known as the son of Mary. So Mary and Joseph also had other children, according to the record that I have given you in Matthew chapter 13 verse 55, repeated in Mark chapter 6 verse 3. We are given a list of other children that Joseph and Mary had. And those men, one of them was called James. In fact, Jude himself here, he begins by telling us that he himself was called Jude, who was a brother to James. And Jude, who was the son of Mary, also had a brother who was called James. And he also had another brother who was called Joseph, who at times would be spelled as Joseph. And he also had another brother who was called Simon. And he also had another brother who was called, or he was the brother called himself, that was actually called Jude. So these were the brothers of Jesus. So when Jude is writing this letter, he of course is writing it, addressing it to Christians. But there are some things that he's actually talking about there, which I would actually consider the purpose of the letter. The purpose which was relevant at the time, the purpose which is very much relevant even at this particular time. And this is one of the purposes why Jude wrote the letter. The purpose of the letter was, of course, he was concerned. This is Jude. And I want you to understand his concern. His concern was that there are Christians that had been endangered. Some of them who were actually endangering themselves through what they were believing. I am saying this is very much relevant even today because we still have Christians today who are very much in danger. They are very much in danger because of what they believe. We even have the majority of the world, which also is very much in danger because of what we are believing. I mean, we all agree that you go to any part of the world, you are going to see people that are religious. They are religious, most of them, in their own way, or they create their own religion and they begin to believe that religion. That's putting yourself into danger. You will discover what that danger is. So, in the book of Jude, the writer is actually trying to conscientize Christians on the day, conscientizing Christians even today, that we should not be endangering ourselves, of course, through our beliefs. But there's also a second purpose that he mentions in the letter. He wanted to expose the false teachers that had infiltrated the Christian community during Jude's time. During Paul's time, in the book of Galatians chapter 1, what Paul says in Galatians chapter 1 is that he was very much astonished. And the reason why Paul was astonished was because there are those people that he had taught and he had preached to. And those people had believed in the true gospel. But the astonishment of Paul comes from the fact that these people were now endangering themselves. They were endangering themselves by going back to heresy, which they had always known. So Paul actually says in verse 6 of Galatians chapter 1, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ, and you are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and they want to distort the gospel of Christ. But listen to what Paul says in verse 8. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel which is contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. So Paul is saying it's a danger. The danger is to listen to a gospel which is not from God. But the danger is also to preach the gospel which is not from God. Because even angels, Paul says, even if it was him or his fellow apostles or his fellow teachers, if they came preaching any other gospel other than the correct or true gospel from Christ, they were supposed to be accursed. And Jude is actually following exactly on the same footsteps. We remember in Acts chapter 15 as well, there is that problem recorded. The reason why we have a letter which the apostles from Jerusalem are going to write in Acts chapter 15 is because there are some men who had exited Judea, Jerusalem in particular, and they had found themselves in a city that was called Antioch. Right in that city is where Paul was preaching from, and those men were teaching people that unless you are circumcised, you are not going to be saved. So Paul is going to find himself going down to Jerusalem to consult with the apostles and the elders there, and their consultation resulted in the writing of a letter, and the penning of that letter is there in Acts chapter 15, was actually correcting a wrong gospel. There was a wrong gospel at the time, or there was a perverted gospel at the time. There is still a perverted gospel or a perverted teaching even in our day to day. So the book of Jude is actually trying to make us aware that there are going to be false teachers who are going to be unleashed on us. It's incumbent upon you and me to detect that this is a wrong teacher and this is a wrong teaching. And we, of course, do what is right. Listen to what he says in verse 3, the book of Jude. Beloved, although I was very eager to write to you about our common salvation, I found it necessary to write, appealing to you to contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. You can only contend for something if there is some competition which is challenging what you believe. So Jude remembered that. Jude knew that there are people that are coming with counter gospel. So you are supposed to contend for the faith. You know, I was thinking as I was reading this, and I thought about what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He actually talks about an athlete. And what he says about this athlete is that an athlete is only going to win, or is only going to get an accolade, or is only going to get a prize if he runs. Of course, in fact, he actually says not all who are going to run are going to win. But it's that one who needs it the most who is going to win. In fact, we have heard that language being used even in soccer. I mean, at the end of 90 minutes, two teams have been playing, and one team has won. And we have heard a coach being asked and say, what made you lose today? I've heard several coaches saying, I think my opponent was needing the points more than me. What is he talking about? He is saying we were competing, but the reason why he won over my team is not because I'm not competent. I could still be competent. But on today's match, I was not as competent as them. They put extra effort. So because of that, they won. They needed it more. They needed the 3 points more than me. So we didn't compete. Paul is talking in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 about an athlete who is going to run. And he is saying it's not all athletes who are going to run, who are going to emerge with a prize at the end of the day. There are those who need it more, who are going to grab it. Others are just going to run and they are not going to get anything because they tried, but they didn't try more. So the one who tried more is the one that's actually going to get. So he continues there, and he says in verse 4, for certain people have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were designated for this condemnation, ungodly people who pervert the grace of our God into sensuality, and they deny our only Master and our Lord Jesus Christ. In fact, the book of John, the book of 1 John, in 1 John chapter 2, verse 22, the Apostle John wrote there, and he was writing some people that were almost like this was being described by Jude. And in fact, John used a very strong word, and he said such people are called antichrists. Who are antichrists, according to John, it's those who deny that Jesus is Christ. He called them antichrists. Those that teach against what Jesus has already taught, they are antichrist. And Jude is saying you should beware of those people because they are there. But listen to what he says in verse 4, earlier in verse 4. They have crept in unnoticed. And I think that's a strong word that we need to take a note of. If something is going to come in unnoticed, what that means is it's not going to perhaps give you time to prepare to fight against it. Because you are not expecting it to come, it's unnoticed. You are going to realize that it's here when it's already here. I mean, we have heard several times in countries, especially that are battered, by natural disasters. Think about the Philippines. It's almost battered. More than 50 typhoons, walk through that country every year. Some of them are very dangerous. They kill people, they destroy, property. But what the experts in weather would do is they warn people to evacuate because there is typhoon so and so. Interestingly, they always give them names. I don't know who names them. They give them names, and interestingly, these names are usually ladies' names. So when they give them these names, they actually warn them before they come. So they evacuate. Why are they evacuating? Because they would want the typhoon to come, but as it's sweeping through, it's going to cause minimum damage, so to speak. Because human life is actually being taken to another route where the typhoon is not going to be coming through. They actually do that because they are able to notice that the typhoon is coming. Imagine if the typhoon would just come unnoticed. It's actually going to wash away the entire population. Imagine if those false teachers are going to creep in like what Jude is saying. They are not going to advertise their coming. They are not going to make it sound very huge. They are coming. They are going to come in slightly, quietly. And most of them, when they teach false, they are not going to teach false that we are going to say this is false, because they are going to sugarcoat their teaching that actually you will believe it as true. Jude is actually saying, for certain people have crept in during his time, 2,000 years at least ago. And Jude's message is still very much live and relevant today. He still is saying they have crept in unnoticed in our lives. We see so many false teachers. We see so many false doctrines that are actually being proffered out there. It's your duty to actually determine that this is false and this is true. But he goes on and he says, those false teachers were long ago designated for condemnation. They are ungodly people who pervert the grace of our God into sensuality, and they deny our only master, who is the Lord. Then in verse 5, he goes on and says, now, I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. This is a very, I don't know why Jude put it here, but it's actually an interesting, as we actually making notes on it. What actually makes it interesting is the question that, so is Jude saying, when the children of Israel left Egypt, Jesus was there? Because we actually have always believed that Jesus is only beginning in the New Testament. Was Jesus already there? And I think we actually have some passages which actually answer that question if ever we had. In fact, the beginning is in the book of Genesis itself. In the first chapter of the book of Genesis, verse 26, actually God is saying, or he at least is talking to somebody, and he said, let us make man in our image. And we actually know that he was talking to Jesus himself. In fact, we have always known from the scriptures that in the beginning, before anything was made, there was God the Father, there was God the Son, and there was God the Spirit. They existed in the beginning, all three of them. So in John chapter 1, verse 1, John writes and he tells us that in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. And as he continues to describe who this Word is, we have no illusion that John was talking about Jesus, who had existed And John even makes a point that there is nothing that was created which was not created by him. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul actually is retelling the story of the children of Israel walking out of Egypt. And in particular, he's talking about their crossing of the of the Red Sea. We made a reference to the Red Sea in our study this morning, where Moses parted this big body of water, and you had a pile of water on one side, and you had a pile of water on another. And of course, they are going to be walking through this narrow passage until they got to the end. Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he actually said they were actually drinking from the rock, and that rock was Christ. So in other words, Paul is saying when they were crossing the Red Sea, Christ was actually present with them. He is the one who was leading them through. So Christ has always been there from the beginning, and he still is there even today. And that's exactly what Jude is saying, that Jesus saved a people out of the land of Egypt. He afterward destroyed those who did not believe. And again, Jesus is the one who destroys. Jesus is the one who is going to save. I think this morning I actually highlighted this fact that when we continue reading our Bible, there is one thing that we should continue putting into our mind. This train of thought that at the end, Jesus is actually going to remain with two groups of people. One group on his right, which is called obedient. One group on his right, which is called disobedient. One group on his right, which is called righteous. One group on his left, I think I said right earlier on, his left, which actually is going to be called wickedness. The wicked group. Jesus is going to destroy. This has always been the standard that we see through the Bible. Let's conclude in verse 6 and of course make some applications. In verse 6 he then says, Jude, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but they left their proper dwelling, he is kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. And again, you see the same train of thought coming in of dividing same kind of people or same things that belong into the same group. They are divided into two. What happened to those angels who, because here we are told about the angels who did not stay within their own position. What happened to those who stayed in their own position? Already now we have two groups of angels. Those who stayed in their position and those who stayed outside of their position. God actually condemned them. In fact, this is just one of the passages that we always talk about. When they actually, you have heard this, I'm sure, that the devil was actually thrown onto the earth. Some of them, they actually come to this passage and they classify the devil as the one angel who was there in the beginning. At what stage did this happen in the chronology or the timeline of the Bible? Of course, we are actually not told. But that's what it is. So what is Jude saying here? Let's of course conclude, make some applications as our conclusion from this short book and from these few verses that we have read. There is one thing, I've already mentioned it, but let's conclude, let's use it as one of the takeaways in our conclusion. We should contend for the faith. I think this is the main message of the book of John. Contend for the faith. I've already used an example of an athlete. And in fact, I know that if you go to the book of Hebrews, for example, in the 12th chapter, the 12th chapter of Hebrews actually talks about, he creates something that resembles. Let's turn to the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, and there's something that I want us to see right there in the beginning, the book of Hebrews, chapter 12. Listen to what the writer says from verse 1. He says, therefore, the therefore is carrying over from what the writer was saying in the 11th chapter. In the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews, the writer gives us an endless list of the people that he said were very faithful and they contended for the faith. One of them who sticks out is Abraham. And of course, a couple of other, giants that he mentions there. So having mentioned all those men, in chapter 12, and women as well, who are also mentioned there. In chapter 12, he begins by saying, therefore, now that we have known that these people who contended for faith are witnesses who are also witnessing you, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. But listen to what he says in verse 2, looking to Jesus, who is the founder and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, he himself endured the cross, despising the shame, and he is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. I think there is nothing that can come as sweet as this passage. And see where the passage is sweet. The writer is actually reminding us of the promise that is there for you and me. But he is saying this promise is up for grabs, and it will only be grabbed by those who are going to lay aside every weight. And according to him, the weight that you need to take away from you is every sin that is clinging on you. In fact, the biggest enemy of humankind is sin. If there was no sin, Jesus would not have come to earth. If there was no sin, Jesus would not have endured the cross. He did that because of our sinful nature. So because of our sinful nature, we need to identify those sins and we pluck them away from us one by one. Think about an athlete before they go, onto the field to run. I haven't seen, and I'm yet to see, and I'm sure during my lifetime I will never see an athlete who really is serious and he wants to win a race, who is going to go there wearing some gumboots, and he's actually going to be wearing an overall, and he's actually going to be putting a helmet on his head. He's not going to do that. In fact, I'm one of those people who have even complained about some of the dressing that these athletes actually put on. The reason why they actually put on that very light dressing, which becomes at times too light for comfort. They put on that dressing for the simple reason that they don't want anything that is going to be wearing heavily on them, so that they are going to be able to be flexible. Look at these twins who were very good in tennis at some point. They've retired, I think, both of them. I mean, there were so many theories that were written about them and about the dressing and this and that. Forget about the dressing. The reason is they didn't want anything on them that is going to be stopping them from being flexible. We understand that to be true in sport. Let's understand that and apply that also into our lives. That if you are having a sin, you are an athlete who actually has something that you need to deal with. I remember when Jesus was teaching the the lesson which we call the Sermon on the Mount. One of the things that he said, I believe, is in the 5th chapter of the book of Matthew. He actually said, if there is a sin that is weighing on you, as you are going to the altar and you want to offer your sacrifice, and while you are on your way, you are so fortunate that you remember that I actually have something against my brother. Leave your sacrifice there. Go back and lay aside that sin. Talk to your brother. Find each other. Then come back, and you are then going to go to the priest and you give the priest your sacrifice. You have laid aside the weight. What I have noticed and what I have experienced is that if you have a sin that you have committed, or a sin that you are always committing and is on you, it's like a hangover on you. Ask those who drink. When they drink, they always have a hangover in the next morning. In fact, some of them would actually want to go and drink again because they are saying, I want to remove the hangover. They then go and drink again. So in other words, you're actually going to be a drinker throughout your life in a bid to take away this so-called hangover. When you have a sin on you, that's exactly what is happening with you. You have something, you have an unsolved business, and that sin is hanging heavily on you. You need to take it away. It could be jealousy. It could be whatever sin that you think about, especially jealousy, is a problem. Because you are actually looking at somebody and you hate him, yet that person is actually going on with their lives. They don't know that you hate them. And that's exactly how hard jealousy is. Because you are actually jealousing somebody who actually doesn't know that you are talking bad about them. That's called blackmailing. That's called slandering. But he doesn't know. She doesn't know about what you are talking about. So it's a problem on you. Let us lay aside all the sins. But when we have laid them aside, let us then run with endurance. And again, if you come back to sport, I mean, in the well-up countries, perhaps not much in Africa, but go to Europe or all over, where they take sports as an industry. They actually build academies. And in the academies, if a child has been identified at the age of 5, and he has been identified or she has been identified that he is good in playing soccer, he is actually going to be channeled towards soccer. He's not going to be, they are not going to waste his time channeling him through the academics. They want him to actually get that which he will maximize on. But when he then is going to the academies, the reason why you actually go there to train long hours, you even fast, you even are going to be told what kind of foods to refrain from, is because they would want you to endure the 90 minutes that you are going to be playing. Otherwise, if you are going to get tired early, you are not going to be able to finish the race. They are actually going to defeat you. And the devil is actually going to be there also opposing you. I have always said this statement, and it's actually true, that the same devil who tempted Eve 6,000 years ago, nearly 8,000 now, is the same devil who is actually there to tempt you and me. So imagine how much experience the devil has accumulated over time. He needs you and me to be to run the race with endurance. But then he concludes in verse 2 by saying, for us to be able to do that, our eyes should be looking at Jesus. In fact, I have seen this as motivation. This month and next month, perhaps, many employers are going to be paying their employees. They call it the 13th check, which is bonus. And people are going to be well motivated because they've actually been given a bonus. It's an extra amount over the amount that you are always getting. That's a motivation. What is our motivation in worshiping Christ? Our bonus, our payday is Jesus. We are looking at Jesus there. So as we are running, taking away every sin that is on me, is it pride? Let me take it off. Is it jealous? Let me take it off. Is it gossip? Let me take it off. Is it theft? Let me take it off. I'm taking out all these things that are clinging on me so that I remain as light as possible, so that I can actually maintain the endurance while I'm looking at my payday. And my payday is Jesus Christ. Looking to Jesus, who is the founder and the perfecter of our faith. I know there are some versions which actually say, who is the founder, the author and finisher of our faith. We need to be looking at Jesus because he is our motivation. That's one thing that we also need to take away from this passage. Contend for the faith and then run with endurance. Another thing that we also see there from Jude is that Jude is very clear that Jesus is the one who destroys. But he's also very clear that the same Jesus who is going to destroy is the same Jesus that who is going to save. Who are going to be destroyed? Those who are going to be found to be disobedient. Those that are going to be found to be wicked. Who are going to be saved? Those who are going to be found to be very obedient. And they are going to be found to be righteous. It's Jesus who is actually going to do that. And the other thing that we also see there is that we should be wary of false doctrine, which is going to be given to us by false teachers. So what we need to do as individuals is, of course, to be able to identify a false doctrine before we can identify a false teacher. You know, I like Priscilla and Aquila, one of the outstanding couples recorded in the book of Acts. one man who was very eloquent, and his name was Apollos, came to Ephesus. And this man did not know much about the baptism of Jesus or the Holy Spirit or this and that. So in other words, we can actually make a conclusion and say at that point, Apollos was not a Christian, because he didn't. I mean, you can only be a Christian if you know the baptism of Jesus. If you don't know, you then can't be a Christian. So Apollos came and he was teaching, of course, aligning himself more to the baptism of John. Priscilla and Aquila were able to tell and detect and say, look, Apollos is very good and very eloquent, but he is not teaching the truth. They pulled him aside and they instructed him according to the gospel, according to the true gospel. They were able to identify that there is a lie in what Apollos is saying. Are we able to identify that this is a lie so that we are able to challenge a lie? You can only teach well what you actually know well. And the last thing that I want us to see there is that saving and destroying is a prerogative that was given to Jesus. But there is something that is also important, which should actually tell us and frighten us, that even angels are not spared. Even angels are subject to punishment. Even angels are also going to be punished. So if angels could be punished, how about me? How about you? Those are some of the things that need to motivate us as we read the small book of Jude. I did go as far as chapter 7, where he is going to talk about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, who had indulged in sexual immorality. And God came, who is Jesus? Jesus also came, who is God the Father. They actually came and they punished those cities. So let us be worried of these things that we are learning from the book of Jude this morning. I hope and trust that those few thoughts are actually going to help us as we are trying to endure, as we are trying to remove all the impediments on us, such that we are going to be found at the end of the day to be those that are to his right, not to his left. Thank you very much.